Ready to go. Ready.
Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to another QBEST webinar by QFF. And with our special guest, Stephen Soutar. Today, I'd like to say a quick hello to Stephen. Hi, Stephen. And my colleague, Jonathan, also from QFF. Hey, Jonathan.
Hello.
Excellent. Thanks, guys. Well, the topic of today's webinar has been very interesting to us because a lot of people talk to us about this, and it's an opportunity that we find in quite a lot of the energy audits that we do, and it's about maximising the use of energy produced from on-site solar panels. And we've got to know Stephen Soutar very well through meeting him at the Renewables and Ag conference and talking webinars with him, talking microgrids with him, in particular his guest appearance on our microgrid webinar. We thought this would be a great topic to help people answer some of those questions about how to get the most out of your solar system. So the way we'll do today, I'll just speak for a couple of minutes, then we'll jump straight into Stephen's presentation for about half an hour or so with some case studies from the work he's done on a dairy and mixed cropping farm in Victoria. We've got time for questions and answers, and then I'll just give a quick wrap up with what you can do next to get involved in some of the energy programs we run here in QFF. So just quickly, a couple of little housekeeping things. We've set this up so everyone's muted and video off, but please feel free to use the Q&A or the chat at the top of the screen there to make any comments or questions, and we'll put those to Stephen as we go through. And we're being recorded, and we'll post this webinar with a short story, a summary story on the QFF's Ag Energy Hub website, which I'll show you the details of, but that should be up and ready to watch again within a week or two. So the QBEST program, Queensland Business Energy Savers Transformation Program, is a program funded by the Queensland Government. It's being delivered by Queensland Farmers Federation, and under that program, we've been working with independent auditors to deliver 35 Type 2 and Type 3 energy audits on farms. So they're very comprehensive energy audits that we've been doing at large user farms. So that's farms that use 100,000 kilowatt hours a year or more of electricity. And we've been doing audits for them, and we're producing a lot of case studies, which we're gradually posting on the Ag Energy Hub website, and we'll be able to show you details of those. And some of those farms have been able to take advantage of a QBEST Ag Farm Energy Efficiency Rebate Program, which is currently closed, but we're hopeful may open for future rounds. The presenter today, as I mentioned, we met Stephen a couple of times at the Queensland, at the sort of National Renewables and Agriculture Conference, presenting about some of the work he's done on some farms in Victoria. He since came on board to give us some advice and presented a webinar for us on microgrids when we ran one a couple of years ago. And he's been doing some great work on how to manage a farm's energy consumption to fit within a solar profile. He's won an Energy Efficiency Council Award for his work in 2023. And as I mentioned, he's featured in a QFF Microgrids webinar, which we'll post a link to in the story that we attach to this article. Stephen's contact details are there below, his website and email address. And with that, I'd like to say welcome, Stephen. Thanks very much for joining us and for your time, and looking forward to hearing what you have to say.
Okay, thanks very much, Andrew. Hopefully we can get the system shared properly. We'll have a go. Just
getting there. Got your desktop there.
Getting it into the right place. Okay, hopefully you can see that.
Perfect.
Okay, just hang on. I'll just put my lights back on. Well, I am an automation engineer, and that was my lights turning off after I've been in the study for an hour. So, yeah, so just a quick few introduction on my background. I've been doing process control engineering for 45 years. I started at Australian Paper in 1979 for 15 years. In Victoria, we have the largest pulp and paper company in Australia, or mill in Australia. That's about 5 minutes from where I live. And of course, about 10 minutes from where I live are the largest power stations in Victoria. After leaving APM, I spent 25 years working as a contracting engineering company in water and wastewater. And my interest in renewables started in the water and wastewater area. And then one day a farmer came up and said, could we do renewables on irrigation within the dairy industry? And I had an interest in doing that. And my view for most of my life is if I've got something that's interesting, then it's easy to work on. So it's been an interesting project for the last 2 or 3 years in looking at how you optimise the use of renewables in irrigation and, in fact, inside the dairy. So I'll just start the presentation. So we're just going to go through the steps that I believe you need to do to optimise the use of renewable energy in agriculture. So the first step that we did in Victoria, as you are doing in Queensland now, is the farmers did audits. And the key is to select the right auditor. So in the case of the farm that we were involved in, they actually did an audit initially of the dairy and the irrigation system that was done by an irrigation auditor from South Australia who runs a lot of irrigation courses, and he's very good at it. But really his background wasn't dairy. So we convinced the Victorian government to do a second audit, and that was done by a dairy specialist. So it's really important to make sure that the auditor knows your system. And we just need to remember that most auditors in the energy sector are actually often involved in building audits. So I'm just trying to get this to the next slide. Okay. So one of the other things about audits, the focus is often on efficiency improvements of individual equipment. So quite often when someone comes in to look at an irrigation system, they look at what a particular pump is doing. And I believe it's much more than that. I think it's really important that you think about it as a system, and how do you make the system work better? Because it's interesting when you get into renewables, that's when the system becomes significantly more important. And in fact, the energy improvement of an individual piece of equipment may in fact not provide the best benefit in the overall system. And the other thing that's really important is, what's the objective? What are you really more interested in? Are you after efficient equipment, or are you after a cost-effective system? Because there's a really big difference between the two. So you can pick a pump, for example, that's really efficient, runs at best operating point when it's operating, say, flat out, and then you put a variable speed drive on and it spends most of its life not actually running at that point, but you may be moving the pump to a less efficient place that makes the overall system more cost effective to operate, and that's especially important when it comes to renewables. So let's look at an example before renewables. So we've got a bore pump transferring water to a dam. This happens on almost all farms that we deal with. So the simple thing when you're only looking at the pump transfer is to select the pump that operates close to the BEP, which is the best efficiency point. Now, the key to making that system work properly is to fully automate it. And the reason you want to do that is you want to run this system as much as possible on off-peak. Now, that may change depending on what the other process requirements are, but if there aren't limitations, then the aim is to run it at the cheapest time. And for a simple system before renewables, that's the best cost-effective solution that you can produce. So this is typical of a process drawing in irrigation within the dairy systems that we've been working on. So there's a dam, some very small, some very big. In this case, this is a 30 kilowatt bore pump with a variable speed drive on it that's filling the dam. And it has two 45 kilowatt pumps which float on this dam that supply a 9, a 7 and a 5 span pivot. Now, one of the important things in doing this, so this is all before solar, one of the important things to do before this is to put pressure transmitters on each of the pivots, especially in the case of these two small ones down here. Because what it allows us to do, as the system can only run one of these two pivots at a time, it's really important that the 45 kilowatt pump is only running at the amount of power necessary to operate the pivot that's working. So when we look at energy efficiency of the pump, we may not be running at the best energy efficient point for the pump itself, but we're running at the lowest cost that's possible for us to provide the right pressure at the centre of the pivot that allows us to get the most effective irrigation. So that's what makes this important. And the variable speed drive, some have a variable speed drive, some don't, but we'll talk about that in a minute. So if this was a fixed bore, that would be pumping into the dam, and we would be controlling that to minimise the cost of operation. Now, when automation is the key, in our case, using our equipment, we put a smart box in, which is our base product, and then we put a remote box out in each place, put the pressure into the remote box and have communication back to the central unit, and then that's fully controlled via an app. So this is, in the case of our app, there's many systems that have different types of apps, but allows us to operate the system, set scheduling times for today, tomorrow and overmorrow, which of course is the day after tomorrow. And then we can also provide some trending on the app. And one of the key things with trending is data's your friend. If you can trend stuff, you can look at problems that are happening that you won't see just by watching normal displays. So in our case, we believe trending is really important. So when you're operating systems before solar, the best way to reduce costs is to do tariff optimisation. So tariff optimisation means that you move loads to the lowest cost tariff. So in this case, this is an actual example from a farm. This graph shows the 7 days of the week. The red periods are the peak periods for power, and the grey and the blue and the light blue are three different pumps: a 45 kilowatt pump, the grey, a 37 kilowatt pump, the dark blue, and a 15 kilowatt pump, the light blue. And this is an example before we started work on this system. So 41% of that power is actually in the peak period, and there's 92 kilowatts of pumping. So after we put automation in and we time shifted the pumping periods and the time that each pump ran, we were able to reduce down to 6% power in the peak period, which gives us about an 18% cost saving. The typical cost savings for tariff optimisation is around 15 to 25. So that between those 2 weeks, this week and this week, that's exactly the same amount of pumping, exactly the same amount of kilowatt hours, but an 18% reduction in cost. You don't need any variable speed drives to do any of this. This can be done with all fixed speed pumping, but that's what's tariff optimisation. Now, one of the key things that disturbs me with tariff optimisation is, yes, it provides a much lower power cost, but the problem is it increases the use of fossil fuels. And the reason for that is that most tariffs do not promote the use of renewables. And this is one of the concerns that we've had from the start is, yes, we're providing a better cost solution, but we're actually not doing the right thing by the planet. So what's the objectives of solar optimisation? So the key objective of solar optimisation is to maximise the reuse of on-site generated renewable energy. So that criteria is really easy to achieve because you could use 100% of the renewable energy if you just put a solar system in that's 50 kilowatts and you use 150, then most days you're going to use all of your renewable energy. But the problem with doing that is you're using a lot of on-peak energy at the same time. So the second criteria, which is much more difficult to achieve, is to minimise the use of on-peak power generation that comes from the grid. But again, the key is that you want full automation. And the automation we were talking about before that did the tariff optimisation is also the same automation that's required to do solar optimisation. So with renewables, it's pretty simple. Most people say all you got to do is add solar. The problem with solar is you get a different thing every day. So the four operating trends here. So this trend here is the perfect day. This trending is from a Willandra farm, which is a dairy farm in East Gippsland, about 3 hours east of Melbourne. And this is 4 different days of solar generation. So yes, you will have very cheap power. The problem is you'll have no control over its generation. And that's what makes the problem so hard. So why is it so hard? If we look at a fixed power application, and a fixed power application might be a pivot or a bore pump without a variable speed drive, so that the power is about the same all the time and you have no control over how much power it uses. So the problem, of course, is if you put a fixed load, which is the red curve here, on the perfect solar day, the result's fairly good because this extra load's going into the grid and there's a small amount of on-peak that's used. So that would produce a reasonably good answer. This day, not quite so good. Not so much into the grid, more on-peak. Then it gets worse, then it gets worse. Now, of course, in this situation, in these 3 situations here, you would obviously get a more cost-effective answer by running at night. And of course, that's what most people do. So how do we maximise the use of solar in that particular case? The simple answer is you can't. So would you put solar on a single fixed power application? Most likely not. Okay, so if a fixed power load doesn't work, which is that 4 examples there, how do we actually make it work? So what happens is if you add multiple loads that some are fixed and some are variable, then you can start producing this answer here, which is where the power usage perfectly matches the solar usage, except that we can't use all of it because we don't have enough load. And then on the other days, you can see that we can change what parts of the plant operate and get a very high usage of renewables. And when we look at the Willandra plant where we won the award for, this is exactly how it works. So someone might say, well, okay, but you haven't irrigated as much on these days as you had here, therefore what do you do? Well, if you can't fit it within the solar pattern on that day, then the system will automatically move that irrigation to nighttime. And therefore, the objective is to meet what the farmer's requirements are. Now, one of the things that farmers do around this time of the year when irrigation is just starting is they run the system in solar only mode. And solar only mode will mean it will only operate when there's solar and won't operate when there isn't. And quite often the farmer will then pick up what hasn't been irrigated as much as he would need either overnight or during the weekend. So when it comes to creating variable loads, clearly VS drives are one of the ways of doing that. And bore pumps that transfer water to dams are one of the really good variable power applications that can be used to use a large amount of solar. But one of the interesting things that also happens is the variable speed drive actually allows the pump to run it at varying efficiencies. So this is an actual curve from a pump that we tested last week. And this is the pump running flat out, producing about 83 or 4 litres a second at about 250 kilowatt hours per megalitre. But what's interesting is when we run the pump down at minimum speed, which is 30 hertz, we produce about 32 litres a second with about 125 kilowatt hours per megalitre. So what it's telling us here is we can run much, much more cost effective if we can run the pump slow, and we can run the pump slow typically when the irrigation demand is a bit lower in the early months of the irrigation season and the late months of the irrigation season. So again, it depends on what's happening at the time, but that's what can happen. Now, the other thing that can happen is, again, do you want to run most effective or do you want to run at lowest cost? Now, the most effective points to run is here. But what's interesting is if you go off peak and you want higher flows, by the time you get to this point, most people would continue to run higher during off peak until you get to this point. But it's actually more cost effective to actually start running the pump at this rate off peak, back up, at this rate off peak and this rate on peak, and then you move up this curve as you want more and this curve until you get to this point here, and that's the equivalent operating cost. So one of the things that we can do automatically within our system is know how much irrigation load is required for the day and therefore know what volume we need to put back into the dam. And we can respond early to that requirement and put it in at the most cost-effective price. Now, that can be done, of course, with and without solar, but what it allows us to do is we can be pumping on peak with solar and paying effectively $0. Obviously, you've paid for the infrastructure, but you can effectively be paying for $0 and using that variable load to provide that solar tracking option. And that can be done with the variable load coming from the bore pump and the fixed load coming from a pivot or 2 pivots or 3 pivots, which we'll show you. So here's an interesting case from a farm that we've just commissioned. It's got a 90 kilowatt bore pump and about 120 kilowatts of solar inverters, but 150 kilowatts of panels. And that allows us to produce a flatter solar generation curve. So the yellow here, this is obviously 4 different days. The yellow here is the solar generated and the brown is the power used by the bore pump. Now, the minimum speed of the bore pump here produces a power usage of about 28 or 9 kilowatts, so that's when it turns on. And you can see it runs all the way up to 90 kilowatts. And of course, there is no way of using the excess during winter, but there is other solar generation or other irrigation equipment on this farm, but this was what happens during the winter. So what this farmer decided to do was to put a 100 megalitre dam in, and he can pretty much fill that during winter from solar generation at virtually zero daily operating cost, given that you've got to pay for the infrastructure. So just to go back, automation is the key. So just to look at what happens with this equipment again, where we've got the bore pump and the pivots. This is actually the result of power generation for a day of this plant. As you can see, this is it's actually 150 kilowatts of solar. It wasn't quite flat out during this day. We produced 674 kilowatt hours of solar. We used 609 of it, and we had a grid usage of 38%. So you can really see here, and if you actually look at it, you can see here where the bore pump started. It got up to here. Then this is a pivot power usage through here. The bore pump starts again. That's the pivot through here. And then the bore pump starts again and uses up to here. So this is two pivots. You can see one there and one here. And then the bore pump running on the top. That's as high as it is practically possible to use. So that was powered by 94% solar and 6% grid. This particular system in this year reduced their power bill from 81,000 to about 1,000. Now, the reason it got to 1,000 was that we were able to use the majority of the solar, and it was a reduction in irrigation that year. But typically it would reduce down from about 80 to about 10. So this is just an example of the weekly report. So you can see here that last week this system spent $147 of energy at an average price of 3.8 cents per kilowatt hour for 101 hours of pivot operation. And this week to date was 115 at 3 cents per kilowatt hour for 74 hours operation of the pivot and 40 hours of the bore pump. So you can see here that $237 and a $90 rebate for the energy that we can't use at the top. And so this is a really, really efficient system at using power, irrespective of what the solar profile looks like, because if the solar profile is really low, you'll find that the bore pump will just run and fill up the dam. If irrigation is required, then the pivots would just run at night. And you can see here, there is very little, compared to energy usage, there is very little off-peak, and see we're hardly running at night at all, which is the off-peak period. So just to show you, this system's been running for 3 years. And it gives you an idea. This was the solar, the power usage during 2021. So the red is on peak and the orange is off peak. And that was all ran manually. So this is the system with 50 kilowatts installed and then 150 kilowatts installed. And the green is the solar used, the red's on peak and the orange is off peak. So you can see while we used very little solar, very little on peak here, there was a bit of off peak, which would be weekends and during the week where they've increased their usage. And you can certainly see in the following years where irrigation demand was much, much higher, that we have still managed a high usage of solar, a very low usage of on-peak power. And then a lot of off-peak power here is catching up and using more irrigation than what can be provided under the solar umbrella. So in this particular case, there was 59% of solar used. In this high period here, we had 86% of solar used. And in 24, we had 82%. So we just look at that from the point of view of on-peak power used. This system here used 37% on-peak power. This year used 2%, 6% and 4%. And that's where the benefit is. Not only are we using lots of solar, but we're using very little on peak. And that's the key to optimising solar. So over these 4 years, and power has increased about 15% during this period of time. They paid on average 27 cents per kilowatt hour in 21. They paid minus 4 cents per kilowatt hour in 22. In 23, it was 4 cents, and last year it was 6.6. This 29 cents now would probably be around the 34 mark if it was applied to this year. So this is just an example of a system we designed purposely for solar. So in this case, there was an existing 50 kilowatts of solar with a bore pump going to a main dam. So the farmer built a local dam, put a floating pump on it, and set up 43 fixed sprinklers. And I think there's about 143 valves. I think there's 172 sprinklers, and then we fully automated that to optimise the use of solar. And this is the end result. This is the solar in the green, is the production during the day. You can see that there was a bit of cloud movement through here, which we didn't really respond to all that much because we don't want to be turning it on and off. And then you can see the bore pump started here, the orange load, and then it got to a certain level where it says, okay, I've got enough power to run one sprinkler valve. So it keeps running that, and then we started the bore up again, and then we got to the point where we could run 2 sprinkler valves, and then we got to the point where we could run 3 sprinkler valves, and then on top of that, the excess power was used by the bore pump. And you can see here that it filled the dam a little bit. The dam went down during the main irrigation time, and then when we finished, we'd had enough time to fill the dam back up with the bore pump running at a variable speed drive of up to 37 kilowatts that could effectively utilise all that excess energy and get the dam level back up. So in summary, we did 357 kilowatt hours of pumping using 353 kilowatt hours of solar. That's 95% used with a 5% feed-in and a 6% usage from the grid. Now, the reason we use 6% from the grid is we don't want to be turning the system on and off just because there's a bit of fluctuation in power. So in this case, the grid's your friend. So we had 21 hectares, 43 control valves, 171 sprinklers, and we applied 8 millimetres of water for that day. And the average usage of power was 1.9 cents per kilowatt hour. So just on this one, so this is just to remind people of what we believe we should be able to do with a microgrid. So this is the system we were just talking about. This is the plant here that we were referring to in the previous slides. Now, this has got 28 kilowatts of spare energy sitting here that we can't use. And there's 12% over here at the one where the fixed sprinkler system is. So what we believe farmers should be able to do is take that 12 over here and that the 28 over here and the 12 over here and run this, which is 41 kilowatts of pumping that wouldn't go into the grid, would be controlled by a 45 kilowatt variable speed drive. So as these amounts change, this would change, and that would put a net balance of 0 around the farm. Okay, that finishes the discussion.
Fantastic, Stephen. Thank you. And it's yeah, good, very comprehensive coverage of some of the information. I particularly like your talk about systems thinking, and we've always talked about considering the whole system rather than just the pump. And so you're, you know, the stages you talked about from farms that may not have solar yet, they can start thinking about ways of tariff optimisation, so operating different devices to fit within their tariffs and minimise the exposure to high costs or demand tariffs that way. And then, of course, going to the solar optimisation and the automation and how useful that's been and how easy that's been for those farms that you highlighted at Willandra. I'm just wondering, like, as an intermediate step, like doing all that manually takes a bit of work, but it's achievable to some extent, isn't it? As an initial starting point, like working a series of pumps with variable speed drives to fit within a solar window.
Yeah, pretty much the key answer at the start is to automate early.
Yep.
So you don't need to do much with what you have to apply automation to it. Now, when we started at these farms, they didn't even have a connection between a pivot and a pump. So the Willandra farmer would watch a light on the pivot during the night, and if it ever started flashing, they would have to get up, go and stop the pump and stop the pivot and fix it. Now, this farm now is fully automatic, and of course they don't go there very often to do anything other than probably getting a pivot back into alignment. But the key is to do the automation early on, because once you've done the automation, part of the automation is that you start collecting data from the automation system that allows you to evaluate what you do next. And that data is usually one of the things that you don't have when you're doing the audit.
Yep.
And data, I don't think people understand how important data is until they have it. Because once they have it, if you said you're not having it anymore, then all hell will break out, because they use it to analyse what they're doing, and then the decision making is then based on facts, not guessing what you think the answer might be, and that makes a lot of difference. So not only do you get the automation and get some reasonably significant cost reduction from tariff optimisation and other things like controlling the right pressure at pivots and those sorts of things, where you can get improvements in system efficiency, but you can then start analysing what will be the real impact of putting solar on.
Yep.
And of course, the typical way of assessing whether you should put solar on is not the way to assess it for the work we're doing, because primarily we are shifting load, which will not be shown on interval data. So you can't go and assess interval data and necessarily come up with the answer as to what and how optimised solar will perform.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And so we're seeing that now with, like, we're in some of the EnergySQ work and QBEST work we're doing, recommending to people to consider some real-time monitoring. And some of the audits we've done, particularly, people see a similar webinar to this on our website around cold rooms and dairies, around how the auditor's been using runtime sensors and real-time meters and thermal imaging cameras and things to just increase the amount of data, so that you're working with facts, like you say, rather than trying to remember how many hours you might have run a piece of equipment. So yeah, definitely data, and the availability of data now through different devices that are becoming more and more cost effective is certainly able to help people with that, and then moving on to automation where it can take control of that. But one of the things is a question that's popped up is around how the system tracks. Like in that last example where you were talking about bringing in a couple of other irrigation systems as the solar power availability increases. The system is able to track how much water it's put on all the different blocks, so that if it does need to resort to overnight power or pick it up the next day, it sort of irrigates to the crop's requirements or the farmer's requirements.
Yeah, I mean, the key thing we need to remember all the time when we're looking at these systems is it's actually an irrigation system. It's not actually a power optimizing system.
Yeah.
So there's a irrigation objective that is set by the farmer for each irrigation application, whether that be a pivot or bike shift laterals or a linear irrigator or whatever they're doing. The irrigation requirement still needs to be set by the farmer. In our case, that's done by setting each hour of operation per day, or in the case of the fixed sprinklers, just telling it that you want to cycle through the system. And then our software will automatically determine what's the best way of achieving that based on what solar you get that day, and then what other hours are available off peak and on peak for that matter. And there are times where we're irrigating 24/7 because that's just what you've got to do. And therefore, you still get the optimal power cost because you will still run what you can during the solar period. But at the end of the day, you have to pay for that power one way or the other. But the key thing that we're moving into now, though, is that we're starting to talk to farmers about doing a 3-day plan where the irrigation periods are not separated on a daily basis, but the 3-day totals are determined. And that allows the system much more flexibility to come up with a much better answer.
Yeah, fantastic. And I mean, you could use soil moisture probes and that kind of sensor as well to adjust that on the fly, I guess, couldn't you? Not on the fly, but according to other conditions like rain and
yeah.
Well,
we've done a slightly different. We are having discussions at the moment with Swan Systems from Western Australia, who have software that produces an irrigation schedule, and the farmer will be able to download that irrigation schedule automatically into our app by pressing a button on the Swan system, and then that schedule will be used by our system to achieve the schedule of the irrigation objectives that the Swan system has set, or that the farmer's modified manually from the Swan system. So rather than us try and part connect into soil analyzers, we've gone to a company that's professional at doing that, and then having it automatically transferred. So you'll be able to go from an optimal irrigation solution to an optimal energy solution / cost solution by simply pressing a button.
Fantastic. That sounds good. And so the last thing I wanted to touch on was your reference to the microgrid, and we did quite a lot of work with that with a few projects in Queensland here. And in fact, we've done some work with some of the data from a lot of the farms that have implemented solar after energy audits, and we've gone back and done measurement and verification to see how much of their solar PV we've been exporting. And I think the added value by farms being able to share some of that excess power across their different connection points to allow this optimization to occur with over a few NIMIs in a farm, it just multiplies the benefits.
I think not only does it multiply the benefit for the farmer, but it also multiplies the benefit for the grid. So, I think it's important from both sides to be implementing solutions that will provide benefit to the grid as well as the farmer. And of course, I think there's also a significant role that farming can play in not only flexible demand management, which is really in part what we're talking about there, but Also in the ability to be able to shut loads down really quickly that can help the network when it's in trouble. And the more that we go to renewable-based energies, the more the system's going to need to be able to do that to remain stable in under certain conditions. So, and there's reward for the farmers to do that. There's already companies that are doing some marina grants in turning on and off refrigeration in supermarkets during certain periods that will cut load quickly. Farms, especially irrigation. In our particular system, we can cut loads off in about 5 seconds. So we could cut every load that's connected to our control systems in Victoria in less than 5 seconds.
Yeah, that's good for that load management. And you could imagine several farms that we've seen where they might have a solar PV system on a farm shed or house, and they might have down the road on their own separate grid connections irrigation pumps that they could cycle on in the same way that you've built up the demand under the generation curve.
Well, we have done that at
the difference is they're just on different NIMIs, but there's a benefit there because the generation gets used locally within that local electricity network.
Yeah, and we at Willandra during that project, we did automatically control a remote NIMI based on solar at a different NIMI. And we proved that we were able to absorb and pretty much put a bubble around the plant and end up with zero export. Now, I think that's really important going into the future. But we really have to, again, I think the biggest problem that we need to resolve moving forward is what we're doing with tariffs, because it's tariffs that stop you doing that. Because you're still paying on-peak net worth tariff, certainly in Victoria, if you transfer energy between one place and another during peak time. And this is even though you might be transferring at 500 metres down the power line. Now, okay, it shouldn't be, there should be a cost associated with doing it, but if you were to charge off-peak tariffs for the use of the poles or even a portion of that, that would probably be fair and reasonable for helping the grid out, especially in the time where we're trying to not put renewables into the system because there's already excess there. But also, there's no reason why farming can't adjust its schedule to bring irrigation forward. If they had scheduled irrigation for tomorrow and today was a very high solar day, there's no real reason why farmers couldn't move that load forward and get the benefit out of helping the grid in that way.
Yes, I think you'd encourage farms to match their loads to suit their generation when they're able to do that across NIMIs as well as within the same NIMI like you've demonstrated today.
Yeah, and I think the more you can convince the network people that you can help, hopefully the attitude within the network service providers will change and that will become the norm. Because they certainly need, there's no doubt the network needs the help of consumers.
Yep. Yeah, well, that's been great, Stephen. Are there any other points that you'd like to make before we wrap up?
No, I think I think the key thing is get the audits done by people that understand your plant in those specific areas. Look at getting automation of the plant done as early as possible, and of course the on-farm connectivity program from the federal government is being released shortly. We're not too sure when, but our equipment is approved as part of that grant, so that's a 50% reduction in the cost of not only our equipment but equipment from many other suppliers. So farmers should be looking at that at the moment. And once you've got that level of automation and you get a better understanding of your processes from the data collected, then you can make sure the next decision's the right one.
Fantastic. Great advice to finish on. Thank you very much, Stephen. It's been great to have you on and listen to some of the work that you've done over the years. So it's been great, and congratulations on the Energy Efficiency Council Award.
Yeah, no, thanks very much for your time. Much appreciated.
I'll just finish up with a couple of quick info notices about some of the things we're doing here at Queensland Farmers Federation. As I mentioned, as part of the QBEST program, we've set up the Queensland Ag Energy Hub, which is a bit of a clearinghouse for all of our energy material that we've developed over the years at QFF, including these case studies and these webinars and the case studies that we're producing as a result of the QBEST audits. There's a lot of information there. It's searchable by sector, technology, irrigation, and location, so you can look for certain horticulture farms in certain regions to see what sort of projects they've been up to. And there's also some top efficiency tips by sector as well. So you can look at some of the key findings across all the audits from different energy sectors. So have a look at that website at the link shown there. Jonathan and I and our colleague Sam are working on the EnergySQ program, which is a type 1 energy audit program where we also do a walkthrough assessment and give farms a bit of extra carbon advice based around energy, but helping them get started about looking at the wider on-farm carbon. We'll give farms that participate an energy and carbon action plan, and we're still looking for farms within those 6 government areas, the 6 local government areas of Southern Downs, Goondiwindi, Western Downs, Toowoomba, Lockie Valley and Scenic Rim. So it's free to participate, and we'd sort of certainly welcome any more farms in those areas to join, and we'll work with them on energy. We do have one more webinar left in this series. We've got one next Wednesday, so we're breaking with the Tuesday tradition, going with a Wednesday one. This one is using a couple of very big energy consuming barramundi farms in North Queensland to consider some things which we think will be very beneficial to other large consuming farms, like looking at voltage, power factor and variable speed drives. So it'll be a really good presentation by another one of our really good QBEST energy auditors there. We also have the Energy Information Service for landholders, and any Queensland landholder can give us a call on that phone number at the bottom of the orange box and ask our energy team any questions about any energy matters. And that can be tariffs, it can be energy efficiency and on-farm renewables, or it can be to point you in the right direction if you've been approached by or are close to a new renewable energy or energy transmission project. We're here to have a listen and give you what advice we can and point you in the right direction to help you answer some of those questions. And that's all for us at QFF. Hope you've enjoyed the webinar today. We've got one more coming up next week, so hopefully you can join us with that one. And once again, Stephen, thank you very much.
Thanks very much for your time.
Thank you very much, Jonathan, for being here and helping us out. And we'll look forward to seeing you all at the next one next week. Thank you.
So just a quick question, Andrew, you still there?